The year was 1877, and the prairie was a vast, unforgiving sea of grass that had swallowed Amos Blackwood's hope whole. His farm was a small, desperate island in its midst, the clapboard house leaning like a man tired of standing, the barn a skeleton of weathered grey planks. A year had passed since the silence had descended, a quiet so profound it had its own weight, pressing down on him from the moment the sun bled over the horizon to the instant it bruised into nightfall. It was the silence left behind by Martha and the child she had taken with her into the cold, unforgiving earth beside the lone cottonwood tree. Amos moved through his days like a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. His grief was not a sharp, wailing thing. It was a dull, permanent ache in his bones, a constant companion in the empty chair across the small kitchen table. He still spoke to her, his voice a low murmur against the ceaseless wind. "Ground's getting hard, Martha," he'd say, looking out the window at the fields that had once been their shared dream. Now they were just acres of dirt that demanded a sweat and blood he no longer felt he had. He was a man hollowed out, left with only the shell of routine: wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Loneliness was a physical presence in the small house. It was in the single cup he washed each morning, the untouched side of the corn-husk mattress, the echo of his own footsteps on the floorboards. The land itself seemed to feel it, offering up only stubborn roots and thirsty soil. His neighbors, the closest a half-day's ride away, were folk as hardened as the land they worked, with little time for another man's sorrow. They saw him at the general store in the distant settlement, a gaunt figure with eyes that looked through people rather than at them, and they kept their distance. He was a man drowning, and no one had a rope to spare. He had survived the summer on meager harvests and the last of their salted pork. But now, autumn was bleeding its colors across the plains, a beautiful, cruel reminder that winter was coming. The wind had a new edge to it, a promise of ice and isolation. In the corner of the barn, a place he tried not to look at for too long, sat the sum of his entire future, a single, fat bag of seed corn. It was the best of last year's crop, saved with a reverence that bordered on worship. It was everything. It was the promise of a spring planting, the only thing standing between him and total ruin. Without it, this farm, this life, this last tether to his memories of Martha, would be lost forever. The bag was his last prayer, his final, desperate wager against the wilderness. One afternoon, as a sky the color of a lead coffin stretched overhead, he saw them. They were just figures at first, shimmering in the distance where the prairie met his tilled land. Not riders, but people on foot, moving with a slow, exhausted deliberation. As they drew closer, his hand went instinctively to the old rifle resting by the door. Tense encounters were the bitter folklore of the frontier, tales told in hushed tones around pot-bellied stoves. He watched, his body rigid, as the small group resolved into a man, a woman, and a small child. They were Cheyenne, he guessed from their dress. The man walked in front, straight-backed and proud, but Amos could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. The child, a boy no older than 5, clung to his father's leg, his large, dark eyes fixed on the farmhouse with a mixture of fear and curiosity. But it was the woman who held Amos's gaze, who made the air in his lungs turn to stone. She was heavy with child, her steps a painful shuffle through the dry stubble of his harvested field. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. She leaned on the man for support, and with every step, Amos saw a weakness that spoke of days, maybe weeks, without sustenance. They stopped a respectful distance from the porch. The man, whose name was Mocha Tavato, did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence a silent, desperate plea. His gaze was steady, not begging, but stating a fact as plain and harsh as the land itself. They were starving. Amos's mind screamed at him, "Send them away. You have nothing. You have less than nothing. You have a bag of seed and a winter to survive." The prejudice of the age, the fear and suspicion that poisoned the very air between settlers and the native peoples, whispered its venom in his ear. But then he looked at the woman again, Vivina. He saw the weary slope of her shoulders, the protective hand resting on her swollen belly. And the wall around his heart, the one he had built stone by grieving stone, cracked. He saw Martha. He saw her in that last week, her body weary but her eyes bright with the promise of the life she carried. He felt the phantom pain of that loss, a physical blow that knocked the breath from him. The rifle by the door suddenly felt obscene in its uselessness. What threat was this? This was not a raid. This was a family on the brink of erasure. "Go away," Amos said, his voice rough from disuse, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He did not mean them. He knew it the moment they left his lips. Moketavato did not move. His eyes flickered to his wife, a universe of worry and love in that one small glance. He said nothing. He did not have to. Their shared humanity, stripped bare of all pretense, hung in the cold air between them. They were two men, two fathers, standing on opposite sides of a chasm of culture and history, but united in that moment by the universal terror of being unable to provide, unable to protect. Amos felt a war rage within him. His mind, practical and terrified, screamed about the seed corn. It was his survival. It was the only logical thing to protect. But his heart, that long dormant and wounded thing, saw Martha's face in the Cheyenne woman's exhausted eyes. What was survival if it meant becoming a man who could watch a child starve? What was a future worth if it was built on the ghost of a woman he turned away? He would be truly alone then, haunted not just by grief, but by a shame that would be colder than any winter. He turned without another word and walked back into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He could feel their eyes on his back. He walked through the kitchen, past the empty chair, and went straight to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and dust and failure. There it was in the corner, the bag. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a beacon of everything he was about to throw away. He hefted it onto his shoulder. It was heavy, heavy with corn, heavy with dreams, heavy with the future. He walked back out onto the porch, the weight of the bag a painful pressure on his shoulder. He did not stop at the steps. He walked right out to where they stood, the dust puffing up around his worn boots. He stopped in front of Moketavato. He looked from the man's stoic face to his wife's, and then down to the small, frightened boy. He said nothing. He simply swung the bag from his shoulder and lowered it to the ground between them. It landed with a soft, final thud. Moketavato stared at the bag. He looked up at Amos, his eyes wide with a disbelief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He seemed to be searching for a trick, a hidden price. He found none in Amos's gaze. Amos just gave a slight, tired nod, a gesture that said, "Take it, it's done." Slowly, as if in a dream, Moketavato reached down and touched the burlap. He looked at his wife, Vivina, and a silent communication passed between them. He then straightened up, his pride returning but transformed. He looked Amos directly in the eye and placed a hand over his own heart. It was a gesture of gratitude so immense and solemn that it needed no words. He then shouldered the bag, a burden that was now a blessing, and helped his wife turn. They walked away, the small boy still clinging to his father, their figures receding back into the vastness from which they came, leaving Amos Blackwood utterly and completely alone with the silence, the wind, and the empty space where his future used to be. The winter that followed was the crucible of Amos's soul. It came down from the north like a hungry wolf, teeth of ice and a howl of relentless wind. The snow fell and fell, burying his failed fields under a shroud of white, erasing the world until only his small, lonely cabin remained, a smudge of smoke against an endless, indifferent sky. With the seed corn gone, a strange and terrible clarity had settled over him. He had not just given away food, he had given away the mechanism of hope. His meager stores dwindled with alarming speed. The salted pork was gone by Christmas. The preserves Martha had put up the summer before she passed, each jar a sweet memory, were next. Soon he was down to a handful of dried beans and a little flour. Hunger became a constant, clawing companion. It sharpened the edges of his grief, made the silence in the cabin louder, deeper. Some days he would sit for hours, staring at the wall, the cold seeping into his bones, wondering if he had gone mad. "A fool's choice, Martha," he whispered to the empty room one night, the wind rattling the window pane like a restless spirit. "I gave it all away." He saw their faces in his mind's eye, the stoic man, the weary woman, the child. Had they made it? Or had his sacrifice been for nothing, a final, pointless gesture in a world that rewarded only strength? The doubt was a cancer, eating away at the certainty he had felt in that one, fleeting moment of connection. He had gambled his life on a stranger's gaze, and now he was paying the price. He grew thin, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. The work of the farm, already a struggle, became a monumental effort. Hauling water from the well left him breathless. Chopping firewood sent jolts of pain through his aching joints. The farm began to decay around him, mirroring his own decline. A fence post fell, and he left it. Shingles blew from the barn roof, and he watched them cartwheel into the snow-covered fields, too weak and too hopeless to repair the damage. He was a man coming undone, thread by thread. There were times he thought of taking the rifle and ending the slow, cold starvation. But the memory of Martha, faint as it was becoming, held him back. And something else, too. The image of Moketavato's hand on his heart. The solemn dignity in that gesture. He had made a choice. To undo it with an act of despair felt like a betrayal, not just of them, but of the man he had been for one brief moment on that cold autumn day. A man who chose compassion over calculation. So he endured. He rationed his last handfuls of flour, mixing it with snow to make a thin, tasteless gruel. He survived, but it was a half-life, a hibernation of the soul. Spring arrived, not as a gentle awakening, but as a slow, muddy retreat of winter. The snow melted, revealing the scarred and barren earth. The world turned from white to a dreary, uniform brown. For a farmer, spring should have been a time of frantic energy and boundless optimism. For Amos, it was a mockery. He stood on his porch, looking out at the vast, unplowed field that stretched before him. It was a blank page he had no ink to write on. The ground was hard-packed and stubborn. His plough was old, its blade dull. His single remaining mule was as gaunt and weary as he was. And even if he could summon the strength to break the earth, what then? He had no seed. The field was a monument to his folly, a vast and silent accusation. He felt a despair so profound it was like drowning on dry land. The fight had gone out of him. He had made his choice in the autumn, and this was the consequence, the end of the line. The farm would be reclaimed by the prairie, and he would simply fade away with it. He sank onto the porch steps, his head in his hands, the sun on his face feeling not like a warmth, but like a spotlight on his failure. He spent a week in that state of listless surrender. He'd wake, look out at the impossible task of the field, and feel the weight of it crush him back into inertia. He had given everything he had to see a family through the winter, and in doing so, he had ensured he would not see his own way through the spring. It was a bitter, lonely irony. It was on a morning like any other that his world changed for the second time. He was on the porch, nursing a cup of weak, bitter chicory root tea, staring at the endless brown of his field when he saw movement on the horizon. At first, it was just a dark line, a disturbance against the pale morning sky. Not a family this time. This was something else entirely. As the line grew closer, it resolved into riders. Dozens of them, then 100, then more. Amos's heart hammered against his ribs. His first instinct was pure, unadulterated fear. This was it. The stories he'd heard, the warnings, the deep-seated dread of the frontier. A war party. He scrambled inside, his hands shaking as he grabbed the rifle. He had no illusions. One man against how many? He peered through the grimy window. He counted until he lost count. It looked like 200 warriors, a river of men and horses flowing silently and inexorably toward his lonely farm. They were Cheyenne. He felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Perhaps his act of kindness had been misunderstood. Perhaps it had been seen as weakness, an invitation. He was a fool, a dead fool. He stood behind the door, the rifle heavy and useless in his hands, and waited for the end. He braced for the sound of war cries, the thunder of hooves, the splintering of wood, but it did not come. The riders came to a halt just beyond the edge of his field, a silent, formidable assembly. The only sound was the jingle of harnesses and the soft snorting of their ponies. The air grew thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. Then, one man detached himself from the group and rode forward alone. As he drew closer, Amos's breath caught in his throat. It was Mokotavato. He looked different now. He was not the gaunt, desperate man from the autumn. He sat tall on his horse, his face serene and strong. He was not carrying a weapon. He stopped his horse 30 yards from the porch and dismounted. Amos slowly, cautiously, opened the door and stepped outside, leaving the rifle behind. He felt impossibly small and frail before the assembled host. Mokotavato walked toward him, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped before Amos, and for a long moment the two men just looked at each other. Then Mokotavato gestured with his chin toward the assembled warriors. "You have no seed," he said. His English was clear, practiced. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. Amos could only shake his head, a wave of exhaustion and confusion washing over him. "No," he managed to whisper. "None." Mokotavato nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. He turned and gave a sharp, clear call to the waiting men. What happened next would be seared into Amos's memory for the rest of his days. It was not an attack. It was a miracle. With a quiet discipline that was awe-inspiring, the warriors dismounted. They moved not with the chaos of a raid, but with the focused purpose of a seasoned work crew. From their horses, they unlashed tools. Some had brought heavy, horse-drawn braking plows. Others had hand plows, their wooden frames carried from their distant camp. They fanned out across his field, a silent army arrayed not for war, but for work. At another call from Mokotavato, they began. The silence was broken by the creak of leather, the grunt of men, and the rhythmic slicing of dozens of blades cutting into the hard-packed earth. They moved in long, straight lines, turning the soil with an efficiency that made Amos's own solitary efforts seem pathetic. They worked without conversation, a shared purpose moving them as one. The field that had been his personal symbol of defeat, an insurmountable obstacle, was being tamed, furrow by furrow, by the very people he had thought might be his end. Amos stood on his porch, stunned into immobility. He watched as the dark, rich soil was turned over, row after perfect row. He saw men who were warriors, hunters, men of the plains, stooping to a farmer's labor, their powerful shoulders bent to the task of plowing a stranger's land. It was an act of reciprocity so grand, so overwhelming, it shattered every preconceived notion he had ever held. This was not a debt being paid. A bag of corn for a day's labor was not an equal trade. This was a statement. This was a lesson in honor, a display of community, a testament to a promise kept, not in words, but in deeds. Mokotavato stood beside him for a time, watching his men work. He pointed to a group of men who were not plowing but were unloading sacks from several pack horses. "We bring seed," he said simply. "More than you gave." Tears welled in Amos's eyes. He fought them back, but it was a losing battle. He looked at the Cheyenne leader, this man to whom he had given his last hope, and saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a man of profound integrity. "Why?" Amos choked out, the word thick with emotion. "Why all of this?" Mokotavato looked from the field back to Amos. He placed his hand over his heart, the same gesture he had used months before. "You fed my son," he said. "You fed my wife. You honored my family when we had no honor left. My people do not forget. A gift of life is answered with a gift of life." He gestured to the field, now more than halfway plowed. "You will eat, your house will be strong again. This is our way." By late afternoon, it was done. The entire field, an acreage that would have taken Amos weeks of back-breaking, spirit-crushing labor, was perfectly plowed. The dark furrows lay neat and ready, waiting for the seed that now sat in heavy sacks by his barn. The 200 warriors gathered their tools, mounted their horses, and assembled once more into a silent, formidable line. They left as they had come, without fanfare. They flowed back into the prairie, a receding river of men, until they were once again just a dark line on the horizon, and then nothing. Amos Blackwood was left standing alone in the vast silence. But it was a different silence now. It was not the hollow silence of grief and loss. It was a resonant silence, filled with the echo of an impossible kindness. He stood before his plowed field, the scent of fresh earth rising to meet him, a smell he had once loved and then come to dread. Now, it was the smell of a future he never believed he would have. He walked down from the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, turned soil. He knelt and picked up a handful of the rich, dark earth. It crumbled in his palm, cool and full of promise. The weight of the past year, the crushing loneliness, the gnawing hunger, it all seemed to lift from his shoulders, carried away with the departing riders. He was no longer just a man grieving what he had lost. He was a man humbled and remade by what he had been given. He looked out at the vast expanse of the prairie, no longer an enemy, no longer a void, but a place of surprising, breathtaking grace. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over his field, over his home. For the first time in a very long time, Amos Blackwood looked toward the coming day, not with dread, but with a quiet, burgeoning hope. He had a field to plant. He had a life to live.
The wind was a blade out of the north, slicing across the high plains and finding every gap in Garrett Calloway's worn coat, every crack in the old cabin walls. It had been 3 years since Eleanor died. 3 years since the cabin went silent, save for the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots and the mournful howl outside. Grief, he had learned, was not a swift river but a slow-moving glacier, grinding away at the landscape of a man's soul until only the raw, exposed rock remained. He worked the land, broke horses, mended fences, but it was motion without purpose, existence without joy. The ranch was his solitary kingdom, and loneliness his only subject. He had sent for a mail-order bride 6 months ago, a desperate, illogical act born of silence and the gnawing emptiness that followed him from sunup to sundown. He hadn't expected hope exactly, but perhaps a cessation of the aching quiet, a practical arrangement, a body across the table that wasn't his own reflection in the polished wood. He'd specified plain, hearty, no nonsense. He'd paid the agency fee, sent the requested funds for travel, and then tried to forget about it. Forget the flicker of something fragile he'd allowed himself to feel. Forget the possibility of a woman arriving who might look at him and not see only the ghost of the man he used to be. Then the letter arrived, not from the agency, but from the railway station agent in Harmony, the nearest settlement, a 2-day ride away. It was brief, blunt. A woman had arrived. Alone, with children, and complications. Garrett felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the old habit of disappointment settling in like dust, more trouble, as if he didn't have enough. But he had paid. He had made a commitment, however distant and transactional it felt now. Duty was another old habit, one grief hadn't managed to erode. He rode out the next morning, the wind still sharp, the sky, the color of old bruises. The 2-day ride felt longer. Each mile was a step further from his solitary, predictable pain and closer to an unknown one. He arrived in Harmony late on the 2nd day, the small collection of wooden buildings huddled against the wind like scared cattle. The station house was cold, smelling of coal smoke and damp wood. Mr. Abernathy, the station agent, was a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose and a permanent frown etched between his brows. He looked up as Garrett entered, his frown deepening. "Calloway," Abernathy said, pushing his spectacles higher. "Took you long enough." "What's the situation, Abernathy?" Garrett's voice was rough from the trail and disuse. Abernathy gestured with his chin towards a corner of the waiting room, near the potbelly stove that offered meager warmth. "See for yourself, she's been here 3 days. Wouldn't take her to the boarding house. Folks got eyes." Garrett turned. In the dim light of the station house, huddled on a bench, was a woman and 3 children. The woman was wrapped in a thin blanket, her face turned away. The children, 2 boys and a girl, were curled together, sleeping or trying to. And then he saw it. The woman's dark hair, braided with beads and feathers. The cut of her simple buckskin dress beneath the blanket. She was not the plain, hardy, no-nonsense woman he had described. She was Apache. His gut tightened. Apache. Here? In Harmony? It wasn't unheard of for Apache to pass through, trading or traveling, but they were usually met with suspicion, fear, sometimes outright hostility. A woman alone, with children, sent by a mail-order agency? It made no sense. "Abernathy," Garrett said, his voice low, dangerously quiet. "The agency, they sent an Apache woman?" Abernathy wrung his hands. "Says here," he tapped a paper on his desk, "woman named, well, it's not a white name, sent from back east, said she matched the description you gave. Hardy, no nonsense, looking for a home." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Didn't say she was Apache." Garrett stared at the woman and her children. One of the boys stirred, a small, dark-haired child, his face smudged with dirt. He looked thin. They all looked thin. The woman pulled the blanket tighter around them, her face still hidden. "And the complications?" Garrett asked. Abernathy leaned in, lowering his voice. "She don't speak a word. Not a word of English. Not that I've heard anyway. Been trying for 3 days. Just silence. And the kids, they're scared, don't talk either." He lowered his voice further. "And folks, well, they're talking. An Apache woman here, sent for. It ain't sitting right." Garrett felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, heavier than the trail dust. This wasn't what he'd paid for. This wasn't the simple transaction, the practical arrangement. This was responsibility, complication, and something else, something that pricked at the calloused places in his heart. Fear? No. Pity? Maybe. A flicker of recognition? The deep, bone-weary look in the woman's posture reminded him of himself. Isolated, silent, carrying burdens unseen. He walked over to the bench. The woman didn't look up. The children's eyes, dark and wide, watched him from the depths of the blanket. He knelt down, slowly, deliberately, showing he wasn't a threat. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice gentle, exploratory. No response. She flinched slightly at the sound but remained still. He tried a different approach. He held out a gloved hand, palm up, a gesture of peace. Slowly, hesitantly, the woman turned her head. Her face was gaunt, smudged, but her eyes, dark and intelligent, met his. There was fear there, yes, but also a deep reserve of something he couldn't name. Pride? Resilience? She looked at his hand, then back at his face. She didn't take it. She didn't speak. He stood up. "All right, Abernathy, I'll take her." Abernathy looked relieved, then concerned. "You sure, Calloway? Folks ain't gonna like it. And she can't talk, you say." "I said I'd take the woman they sent. This is the woman they sent." Garrett's voice was firm, final. It surprised him how quickly he'd made the decision. It felt less like choosing and more like submitting to an inevitability. He had signed the paper, paid the money. This was the outcome. He wouldn't abandon her, not here, not like this. Even if she wasn't what he'd expected, even if she brought the kind of trouble he usually went out of his way to avoid. He bought supplies, extra blankets, food, a few things for the children, though he didn't know what they might need. He loaded his wagon, which he'd brought instead of riding horseback due to the letter mentioning the package was too large for a single rider. It seemed the agency had taken his request for a hardy woman, rather literally, sending him an entire, unexpected family. Getting them into the wagon was a silent, tense affair. The woman, whom Abernathy's paper listed by a series of sounds that looked nothing like the name Nahili from his mind, but which he would later learn sounded much like it, gathered her children with quiet efficiency. She didn't look at Garrett, but guided the children into the back of the wagon, wrapping them tightly in the new blankets. Garrett offered her a hand up. She hesitated, then accepted it, her touch brief and cool. She settled herself beside her children, a silent sentinel guarding her small, frightened flock. The journey back was a study in silence. Garrett rode on the driver's seat, the woman and children behind him. The wind still blew, but it felt less hostile now, simply a fact of the landscape. He didn't try to talk. He felt their eyes on his back sometimes, silent questions he couldn't answer. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He didn't know why she had been sent through a mail-order agency. He knew nothing, except that he was taking them to his home, his solitary, silent home, and nothing would ever be the same. They reached the ranch late on the second day. The cabin sat on the rise, a dark, solitary shape against the bruised sky. It looked unwelcoming, even to him. He stopped the wagon. "This is it," he said, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. The woman and children looked out, their faces passive, unreadable. He climbed down and went to lower the wagon tailgate. He helped the children down first, small, stiff bodies that didn't resist, didn't speak. The older boy, perhaps 6 or 7, clutched a small, worn wooden bird. The girl, younger, held tightly to the woman's hand. The youngest boy, maybe 4, stayed close to the woman's skirts. He helped the woman down last. She didn't meet his eyes. "It's cold," he said, unnecessarily. "Let's get inside. I'll start a fire." They followed him to the cabin door, hesitant. He opened it and stepped aside, letting them enter first. They paused on the threshold, looking into the dim, single room. It was spare, clean, but filled with the tangible emptiness left by Eleanor's absence. They stepped inside, moving cautiously, sticking close together. Garrett went to the hearth, knelt, and began building a fire. The familiar ritual was grounding. He heard their quiet movements behind him, exploring the small space with their eyes. He heard the soft rustle of their clothes. No voices, still no voices. When the fire was crackling, chasing the chill from the room, he stood and turned. They were standing near the table, watching him. The woman finally spoke. It wasn't English. It was a soft, melodic series of sounds, low and quiet. She gestured towards the corner, towards a small, unused cot. Garrett shook his head. "I don't understand," he said, gesturing helplessly. She repeated the sounds, pointing more emphatically. He tried to guess. "Sleep? You want to sleep?" He pointed to the cot. She nodded, a small, sharp nod. Her eyes, though, held something more, something like a question or a statement he couldn't grasp. He set out food, hardtack, dried meat, coffee. He filled a kettle with water and hung it over the fire. They watched him, silent. He motioned to the table. The woman led the children over, and they sat, still wrapped in blankets. They ate sparingly, quickly, like people accustomed to hunger. He watched them. The children were beautiful, with their mother's dark eyes. The older boy's grip on the wooden bird never loosened. The girl stayed pressed against her mother's side. The youngest looked around with wide, wary eyes. After they ate, the woman gathered the children and settled them on the cot. They lay close together, a small, breathing unit in the corner of his vast, silent world. He stayed by the fire, watching the flames, listening to the wind outside, acutely aware of the 4 other presences in the room. It was the least lonely he had been in 3 years, and perhaps the most uncomfortable. Days bled into a week. A routine, silent and strange, began to form. Garrett worked outside, coming in for meals which they shared in near total silence. He'd offer food. She'd accept with a brief nod or a soft sound in her language. He'd point to tasks, bringing in wood, fetching water from the well, and she would understand from his gestures, performing the work with quiet competence. Her movements were economical, practiced. She was, he observed, undeniably hardy and efficient, just as he'd requested, just not in the way he'd imagined. The children remained silent, wary shadows. They stayed close to their mother, watching Garrett with large, unblinking eyes. He tried smiling at them, offering a small piece of dried apple. They shrank back, pressing into their mother's skirts. He learned their names from the paper Abernathy had given him, names that felt awkward and foreign on his tongue. Ishke, the oldest boy, Yana, the girl, Chaitan, the youngest boy. He said them sometimes, quietly, but they didn't seem to respond. He tried simple English words pointing to objects: fire, water, wood. The woman, Nahili, would watch his mouth, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes, a flicker of understanding would cross her face, but she never repeated the words. It was like trying to build a bridge across a chasm with no common language, no shared experience to anchor the ropes. Prejudice arrived before the spring thaw. A couple of riders from Harmony showed up one afternoon, ostensibly to trade some supplies: Bill Jenkins and Tom Brody. Brody had a narrow face and eyes that seemed to squint perpetually, as if the world was always too bright or too unpleasant. Jenkins was burly, loud. Garrett met them outside. He saw their eyes flick towards the cabin, then back to him, questions unspoken but loud in their stares. "Calloway," Jenkins boomed, dismounting. "Heard you got yourself a visitor." "Came on the mail train," Brody added, his voice oily. "Heard she ain't what you ordered." Garrett's hand settled on the worn grip of his pistol, tucked into his belt. "She's the woman the agency sent. What's it to you?" Brody smirked, a mean twist of his lips. "Just curious is all. Ain't natural, is it? A white man and—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the cold air. "She's no trouble," Garrett said, his voice low. "She's under my roof." Jenkins chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. "Under your roof, huh? Heard she brought some young'uns too, a whole passel of heathens." Garrett's jaw tightened. The protective instinct, dormant for so long, flared sudden and hot. "Get on, Jenkins, Brody. You got trade or you just rode all this way to gossip?" Brody's smirk vanished, replaced by resentment. "Just making sure everything's proper, Calloway. Folks get uneasy when things ain't proper." "Everything's proper here," Garrett said, his eyes holding Brody's. "Now, unless you want trouble, you'll take your trade and ride." They traded quickly, their manner sour. As they rode away, Garrett heard Jenkins say something low to Brody, and Brody laughed, a nasty, knowing sound. Garrett watched them go, a cold knot in his stomach. The external threat had arrived. It wore the faces of his neighbors. Inside, Nahili had heard. Garrett knew it. She stood near the window, her back straight, watching the riders disappear into the distance. The children were huddled behind her skirts. He didn't say anything. There were no words in any language that could adequately explain the ugliness he had just witnessed, or the fear it stirred. Slowly, painstakingly, understanding began to dawn between them. Not through language, but through shared tasks, through observation, through the small, quiet moments that built up like stones in a wall. Garrett learned that Nahili could read the land with an insight that humbled him. She found plants he didn't know were edible, saw signs of weather coming long before he did. He saw her tenderness with her children, the fierce, silent devotion in her eyes. One evening, as Garrett mended a bridle by the fire, Yana, the little girl, approached him. She held out the wooden bird, her fingers tightly clasped around it. It was crudely carved but recognizable. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. He took the bird gently. "It's nice," he said quietly. "Did Ishke carve it?" Yana nodded, a small, quick movement. It was the first time she had responded to his words, even with a nod. "He's good," Garrett said, handing the bird back. Yana took it, a flicker of something like pride in her eyes, then scurried back to her mother. It was a tiny victory, a crack in the silence. Another time, Garrett was struggling with a stubborn fence post, the ground frozen hard. Nahili came over, carrying a pail of hot water from the kettle. Without a word, she poured it around the base of the post. The frozen earth softened just enough for him to drive it in. He looked at her, grateful. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her face devoid of expression, but her eyes held a quiet knowing. He realized she wasn't just a burden, she was a partner, a silent, unexpected one. One night, a fierce storm blew in. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the cabin walls, threatening to tear the roof off. Garrett checked the shutters, reinforced the door. He found Nahili sitting by the fire. The children pressed close to her, their faces pale with fear. He saw her wrap her arms around them, her body a shield. He sat down near them, adding another log to the fire. He didn't say anything, just offered his quiet presence. After a while, Ishke, the older boy, edged closer to Garrett, his eyes wide, looking from the storm outside to Garrett's calm face. Garrett reached out tentatively and rested his hand on the boy's small shoulder. Ishke didn't flinch away. He leaned into his mother, but his gaze remained fixed on Garrett, a silent question. Garrett simply squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. The boy didn't speak, but his breathing seemed to steady slightly. In these quiet moments, a fragile trust began to bloom. Garrett stopped seeing Nahili and her children as a problem, a complication, something he'd mistakenly ordered. He began to see them as people. Resilient, silent, carrying their own unseen burdens. He started leaving small things out for the children. A smooth stone, a feather he found, a piece of jerky cut into smaller strips. He saw Nahili watch him, her dark eyes assessing. And sometimes, he thought he saw a flicker of something warmer than caution in their depths. One morning, Garrett woke to find Nahili outside the cabin before the sun was fully up, standing with her face lifted to the faint light, her eyes closed. She looked not like a refugee or a burden, but like someone drawing strength from the land itself. He watched her for a moment, unseen, and felt a profound sense of distance, a reminder of the gulf between their worlds, their histories. But the gulf felt less like a chasm and more like a wide river he was slowly learning to cross. Spring arrived, tentative at first, then with a rush of green and wildflowers. The children ventured outside more, always staying close to the cabin. Ishke practiced throwing a small spear their mother had fashioned from a stick. Yana collected smooth stones by the creek. Chaitan chased grasshoppers, his silent glee evident in his quick, darting movements. Garrett watched them, a ghost of a smile sometimes touching his lips. The cabin felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a home, however unconventional. Then came the day of the fire. It started miles away, a small plume of smoke on the horizon, but the wind, whipping across the dry prairie, carried it swiftly towards the ranch. Garrett spotted it from the corral, his heart leaping into his throat. Wildfire was a terrifying enemy, fast and indiscriminate. He ran towards the cabin, shouting, "Nahili, fire, we have to go." She was outside with the children. Her eyes, usually so calm, were wide with alarm as she saw the smoke, thick and black, churning in the sky. She understood. Fire was a universal language of fear. Garrett grabbed buckets, began soaking blankets, anything that could slow the fire's progress if it reached the buildings. He was shouting instructions, frantic. Nahili didn't understand his words, but she understood the urgency, the danger. She gathered the children, pointing them towards the root cellar, a small underground structure near the cabin, the safest place they had. "Stay there," Garrett yelled to them, though he knew they wouldn't understand the words. "Stay down there." As the children scrambled into the cellar, Nahili didn't follow them. She ran towards Garrett, her face set with determination. She pointed towards the creek, then towards the dry grass around the barn. She spoke, a rapid, urgent stream of Apache words, gesturing wildly. Garrett stared at her, confusion battling panic. What are you saying?" She grabbed his arm, pulling him towards the creek. She pointed at the water, then made a sweeping motion with her arm across the ground towards the fire. Then she pointed to a patch of burned ground from a previous, smaller fire, gesturing that the fire would stop when it reached earth that had already been consumed. Fire breaks. She was telling him to fight fire with fire, to burn a line ahead of the main blaze, starving it. He understood. It was risky, dangerous work, setting a backfire. But she was right. With the wind this strong, soaking the cabin wouldn't be enough. They needed a buffer zone. "Okay," he yelled, adrenaline surging. "Okay, we burn a line." She nodded, understanding his tone, even if not every word. They worked together with a frantic, unspoken rhythm. Garrett used a torch fashioned from rags soaked in kerosene, setting small fires in a line stretching out from the creek, moving against the wind. Nahili followed him, carrying a wet sack, beating down the flames on the side closest to the cabin, controlling the backfire, making sure it didn't rage out of control in the wrong direction. The heat was intense, the smoke choking. The roar of the approaching wildfire was deafening, a hungry beast devouring the prairie. Garrett's eyes stung, his lungs burned. He stumbled, coughing. Nahili was instantly by his side, pulling him up, her small hand surprisingly strong. She pushed a wet cloth into his hand, urging him to cover his mouth. They worked, two figures silhouetted against the inferno, fighting the fire demon with its own weapon. The backfire spread, slowly at first, then catching hold, burning a black scar across the prairie. The main fire advanced, a terrifying wall of flame, consuming everything in its path. The air grew searing hot, the wind howled, a symphony of destruction. Garrett thought of Eleanor, of the life they had planned, reduced to ashes by another kind of fire. He thought of the children in the cellar, trusting him, trusting their mother. He wouldn't let them be consumed. The moment of truth came as the main fire reached the edge of the burned-out zone. It roared, seemed to hesitate, looking for fuel. There was none. It licked at the blackened earth, sending sparks high into the air, but it could not cross. Slowly, impossibly, the fire began to diverge, flowing around the burned ground, leaving the cabin, the barn, the root cellar, untouched in an island of safety. They stood, watching, covered in soot, their faces streaked with sweat and tears. The roar began to recede as the fire moved past, still burning, but no longer a direct threat. Exhaustion hit Garrett like a physical blow. He sank to his knees, his chest heaving. Nahili knelt beside him. She didn't speak, but she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, steady. He looked up at her. Her dark eyes, though tired, held a profound relief, and something else he hadn't seen before. Respect, acknowledgement. In the face of shared danger, the barriers had finally fallen. They waited until the immediate danger had passed, the sky still dark with smoke but the nearest flames distant. Garrett helped Nahili bring the children out of the root cellar. They emerged, blinking in the smoky light, their faces pale but unharmed. They saw the blackened earth surrounding them, the still smoking remnants of the backfire, and understood they had been saved. Chaitan, the youngest, ran to his mother, burying his face in her skirt. Ishke and Yana looked at Garrett, then at their mother. Later that evening, sitting by the fire in the cabin, the air thick with the smell of smoke but the terror receding, a different kind of quiet settled over them. It wasn't the silence of isolation or mistrust, but the quiet of shared experience, of earned peace. Garrett looked at Nahili, sitting with her children curled around her. "You saved us," he said, his voice hoarse. "You knew what to do." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She hesitated, then, slowly, haltingly, she spoke. "Fire, teach," she said, her English broken, heavily accented, the words clearly difficult for her. "Land, teach, my people, no." Garrett stared at her, stunned. She could speak, not fluently, not easily, but she could speak English. You can speak?" he asked, foolishly. She gave a small, tired nod. "Little, hard. Why didn't you speak before?" She looked down at her hands, picking at a piece of dried mud on her skirt. "Fear," she said simply. "White eyes, they hate. My husband, killed." Her voice was low, raw with pain. "Children, scared, silent, safe. Silent, safe." Garrett felt a cold understanding settle over him. She had been protecting herself and her children. Her silence had been a shield, a desperate strategy for survival in a hostile world. The mail-order agency, the journey, arriving alone with children to a strange white man who barely spoke to her. It must have been terrifying. His own grief and silence had mirrored hers, creating a wall he hadn't even realized he was helping to build. I didn't know," he said, the inadequacy of the words heavy between them. She looked up again. "Now you know." Her gaze was steady. "We stay or go?" The question hung in the air. Go. Where would they go? Back to Harmony, to face Brody and Jenkins and the others? Back to wherever she had come from, a place of such danger that she had risked this. Garrett looked at the children, sleeping soundly now by the fire, safe for the moment. He looked at Nahili, resilient and watchful. He looked around his cabin, no longer empty, no longer silent in the way it had been. It felt full of life, of quiet strength, of something that might, with time and care, grow into something like home. His decision in Abernathy's station house had felt like duty. His decision now felt different. It felt like choosing. "Stay," he said, his voice firm. "Stay. This is your home now, if you want it." Nahili searched his face. He didn't know what she was looking for. Honesty, commitment, a promise he might not even know how to keep, but he knew he meant it. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. A flicker of relief crossed her face, quickly masked by her usual reserve. "Stay," she echoed, the single word a confirmation, an acceptance. The days after the fire were different. The shared language was still sparse, broken, a mix of his simple English, her hesitant words and gestures. But the silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a space filled with understanding, with burgeoning respect. Garrett learned more, piece by painful piece, about Nahili's story. Her village attacked, her husband killed, their escape, the desperate journey. The mail-order agency was a last unlikely hope, facilitated by someone who had owed her husband a debt, someone who had connections east. It was a leap of faith into the unknown, a desperate gamble for survival. He told her about Eleanor, about the fever that had taken her, about the silence that had followed. He spoke haltingly of his grief, the years of living like a ghost in his own home. She listened, her dark eyes reflecting understanding he didn't need words to feel. Grief, loss, survival. These were languages they both knew. The community's reaction was slow, mixed. Some in harmony continued to glare, to whisper. Brody and Jenkins stayed away for a while, but Garrett knew the prejudice hadn't vanished. But others, like Mr. Abernathy, who had seen their quiet strength and efficiency after the fire, began to look at Nahili with less suspicion. She didn't try to assimilate, didn't try to be someone she wasn't. She was Nahili, an Apache woman, living on Garrett Calloway's ranch, raising her children. Her quiet dignity, her competence, slowly chipped away at the wall of prejudice, at least for those willing to see. The children began to speak, tentative words at first, then gaining confidence. English words, learned from Garrett and from their increasing interactions with the world outside their immediate family. Ishke lost some of his wariness, asking Garrett questions about the horses, about the land. Yana, still shy, would sometimes bring Garrett a wildflower she had found. Chayton, the boldest, would chatter in a mix of languages, a small living bridge between their worlds. Their life was not a fairy tale. It was hard work, isolation, the constant challenge of the land, and the lingering shadow of prejudice, but it was a life lived together. Garrett and Nahili worked side by side, managing the ranch. He learned from her knowledge of the land. She learned from his knowledge of ranching. They made decisions together, their communication a blend of words, gestures, and a deep, intuitive understanding that had grown between them. The silence in the cabin was gone, replaced by the quiet sounds of a family, children's footsteps, soft voices, the rhythm of shared chores. Garrett still carried his grief for Eleanor, a dull ache rather than a gaping wound. But the loneliness that had defined him had receded, replaced by the quiet presence of Nahili and her children. He had paid for a mail-order wife, a transaction meant to fill a void. He hadn't expected an Apache woman with 3 silent children. He hadn't expected the fear, the mistrust, the shared danger, the slow, painstaking process of building a bridge across a chasm of culture and language. He hadn't expected to find not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely new, something unexpected and deeply precious. He had paid for a wife, but he had found a partner, a family, and the unexpected, quiet dawn of a different kind of hope in the heart of his lonely world. The wind still howled sometimes, but inside the cabin there was warmth, connection, and the enduring, resilient pulse of life.